One signature, one single stamp of approval. And with that, America quietly began building the most powerful military headquarters the world had ever seen on a piece of ground that, just months earlier, nobody wanted anywhere near their name. 29 acres, 17.5 miles of corridors, 6.5 million square feet of usable space, more office space than the Empire State Building, and all of it built from an empty swamp to a fully operational military command center in just 16 months. I've documented construction projects on every continent on Earth, and I can tell you honestly, standing in front of this building feels different from anything else I've filmed. You don't just see history here. You feel it pressing directly against your chest the moment you walk up to these walls. It's the summer of 1941. America hasn't officially entered the war yet, but the drumbeats are getting louder every single week. And back in Washington, the United States War Department has a humiliating, dangerous problem. It's scattered across 17 separate buildings, phone lines running, between offices blocks apart, documents shuffled across the city by messenger, a military machine desperately trying to function without a functioning brain to coordinate it. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. Congress approved the project in just 72 hours, the fastest military construction authorization in the entire history of the United States government. The original plan called for placing the building at a site known as Arlington Farm, directly across the river from Washington, until President Roosevelt personally intervened, worried the massive structure would permanently block the sacred sightline to the Lincoln Memorial. So Roosevelt redirected the entire project south, to a piece of land nobody in their right mind actually wanted, a flood-prone wasteland that had been quietly used as the region's garbage dump for the better part of 30 years. What they managed to turn that dump into, in just 16 months, still stands today as one of the most staggering construction achievements in modern history, and almost nobody outside the people who lived it truly understands how they pulled it off. Picture what they actually started with. Not solid bedrock, not flat, buildable ground. A soggy, flood-prone wasteland sitting directly beside the Potomac River, layered with 3 decades of buried trash and unstable fill that any sane engineer would have walked away from without a second thought. The man handed this seemingly impossible task was Brigadier General Brahan Somervell, a man who reportedly didn't measure deadlines in months, he measured them in weeks, and treated every single delay as a personal failure. Architect George Bergstrom and his design team worked 96 consecutive hours without meaningful sleep, producing the first complete Pentagon design entirely by hand. No computers, no digital modeling, just pencils, drafting tables, and raw institutional urgency. The now iconic 5-sided shape wasn't some grand artistic statement. It was a purely practical solution forced by the awkward 5-road intersection at the original Arlington Farm site, a shape that simply carried over even after the location itself changed. And the concentric ring layout wasn't just clever design either. It was engineered so that no single office inside the entire building would ever be more than 7 minutes walk from any other office, anywhere inside the structure. For wartime military headquarters, coordinating operations across the entire globe, that wasn't a luxury feature. It was pure tactical necessity. Ground was officially broken on September 11th, 1941, exactly 60 years, to the exact calendar date, before completely different. September 11th would scar this very same building forever, a coincidence so strange that even people who worked on the original construction crew could never quite explain it. After the attack on Pearl Harbor just months later, the entire workforce exploded from a modest crew to 15,000 workers, running 3 full shifts around the clock with no weekends and, remarkably, no pause even for Christmas. The very first challenge the engineers faced wasn't structural steel or architectural design. It was the ground itself. 5.5 million cubic yards of unstable fill and swamp material sat beneath the planned footprint, and every single cubic yard of it had to go before construction could even begin. In just the first 4 weeks alone, crews physically removed 680,000 cubic yards of earth, working with absolutely no GPS, no computerized grading systems, nothing but experienced men reading the contours of the land with their own trained eyes and adjusting in real time. 13,000 additional workers were sourced from across the state of Virginia and assembled within days, the kind of instant, coordinated mobilization that only a nation fully committed to war could realistically pull off. When the soil tests finally came back, the news was worse than anyone had feared. 40 feet of unstable peat and soft clay sitting directly beneath the site, dramatically too weak to support the sheer weight of a building this massive. The solution engineers landed on was almost radical for its time, a fully distributed pile foundation system, driving over 41,000 individual concrete pilings deep into the unstable ground beneath the site. In total, engineers drove 41,492 piles, Each one hammered relentlessly until it physically refused to sink any further, meaning the surrounding soil had finally compacted enough to bear real structural weight. That single phase alone consumed 4 full months. As the piling work finished section by section, the enormous foundation mat pour began immediately. Behind it, running continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without a single scheduled pause. 5 separate concrete batching plants were built directly on site just to keep pace with demand, and at peak output, crews were pouring roughly 1 cubic yard of concrete every 60 seconds. Remember, there were no concrete pumps available in 1941, which meant every single load had to be physically moved by hand, and by chute, an almost unimaginable amount of raw manual labor by today's construction standards. The foundation alone ultimately consumed 680,000 tons of material. The full foundation was finally completed in December of 1941. The very same week, Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor, and virtually overnight, the entire mood and urgency surrounding this project transformed completely. Right now, buried directly beneath the building's footprint, there are still 41,000 concrete piles driven 25 feet deep into the Virginia clay, holding up everything above them exactly as they have for over 80 years. Above ground, 43,000 tons of structural steel arrived from mills in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, delivered directly to the construction site by a dedicated rail siding built specifically for this one project. The ironworkers of 1941 climbed and worked on that exposed steel without harnesses, without fall protection of any kind, casualties simply accepted as part of the grim cost of building at wartime speed, a brutal reality of an entirely different construction era. To move fast enough, the entire structure was divided into 5 separate sections, one per side of the building, allowing entirely different construction crews to work simultaneously on all 5 faces at once, dramatically compressing the overall timeline. Every single week, master surveyors carefully checked that all 5 independently built sections remained perfectly aligned, because even a small deviation on any one face would create a catastrophic structural mismatch at the junction points where the sections eventually had to meet. 5 concentric rings, labeled A through E, connected by 10 radial corridors, with the exact same floor plan repeated identically on all 5 floors, an almost obsessive commitment to standardization that allowed workers to move fast without constantly relearning new layouts. In an extraordinary display of pure operational efficiency, finishing work began on the lower floors, before the upper floors had even finished being framed, meaning parts of the building were actively being occupied by workers, while other parts, directly above their heads, were still very much under construction. With steel now strictly rationed for the broader war effort, architects were forced to substitute materials wherever they possibly could, replacing steel. Window frames with wood and steel reinforcement with solid concrete walls wherever structurally acceptable. Indiana limestone, the exact same prestigious stone used on the Empire State Building and the National Cathedral, became the one truly premium material the project team refused to substitute or cut corners on, no matter how tight the wartime supply chains got. Every single limestone panel was precision cut to its exact final size, directly at the quarry in Indiana, and delivered to the site in the exact sequence it would be installed, because the cramped construction site simply had no spare room to store excess material. This particular stone traveled all the way from Indiana, thousands of tons of it, and remarkably, limestone remained the single premium material the entire project refused to compromise on. The masons setting that stone were among the most skilled tradesmen in the entire country in achieving this pace of installation without any modern lifting equipment stands today as a genuinely extraordinary physical feat. At peak construction, more than 15,000 workers were on site simultaneously, and simply feeding that many people required 3 fully operational cafeterias running continuously around the clock, together serving 35,000 meals a day, including a dedicated menu specifically designed for the overnight shift. Construction never once paused for meal breaks. Work simply continued in staggered shifts, so the project never actually stopped moving. The build pushed straight through the brutally cold winter of 1941 and 1942, with temperatures repeatedly dropping below 0, but the ongoing war allowed absolutely no room for a seasonal pause of any kind. Tragically, the vast majority of those 15,000 workers were never formally named in any surviving official record, meaning their entire contribution to one of history's greatest construction achievements exists today only. In the physical building itself, silent and largely anonymous, below the main occupied floors, engineers built an entire hidden infrastructure layer, boiler rooms, electrical switchgear stations, telephone exchanges, and a pneumatic tube mail system threading through the basement to move documents instantly across the massive structure. The building's total electrical load ended up exceeding the entire electrical demand of the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, forcing engineers to construct a dedicated on-site substation purely to keep the building powered. Workers installed a staggering 184 miles of plumbing, piped throughout the structure, supporting restroom facilities designed to serve 35,000 people daily. But shamefully, under Virginia's segregation laws, still in effect in 1941, those facilities were designed as entirely separate spaces divided by race. Secretary of War Henry Stimson later ordered the segregation signage physically removed from the building, quietly defying state law in the process, though the separate facilities themselves had, by that point, already been built and did exist. Plastering, painting, and flooring across 17.5 miles of corridors required a dedicated finishing. Workforce of well over 3,000 skilled tradespeople working in parallel. The corridor floors themselves were finished in terrazzo, marble chips embedded in cement and polished to a smooth, mirror-like shine, deliberately chosen for its extreme durability under decades of constant foot traffic. The 5-acre central courtyard at the heart of the building wasn't simply decorative, it functioned as both a natural light well for the interior office rings and a critical ventilation core keeping air circulating through the entire massive structure. Engineers installed 19 escalators and 13 passenger elevators, at the time among the largest single elevator installations found in any American building anywhere in the country. 131 separate stairways were threaded throughout the structure, ensuring that no section of the building was ever more than a single flight of stairs away from multiple emergency exits. The building's entire communications infrastructure was treated as classified from the very first day of construction. With 13,000 telephone handsets wired into a dedicated internal exchange, running on its own completely separate cable routes, isolated from the rest of the building's systems. Workers installed 7,748 single-glazed wood-framed windows throughout the structure, a deliberate steel-saving wartime measure that, decades later, would require complete window replacement during a major 1990s renovation. The roof, covering a staggering 5.1 acres, was applied section by section, as each floor beneath it was completed, sealing the growing structure against brutal Virginia winters, even while construction continued elsewhere in the building. Crews installed 500 miles of ductwork throughout the structure, and sheet metal contractors were forced to build entirely temporary fabrication shops directly on site just to keep pace with the sheer volume of material demand. Month after month, aerial photographs captured a transformation that seemed almost physically impossible. A swamp, then a foundation, then a raw steel skeleton, and finally, unmistakably, a building. The full limestone facade, covering 485,000 square feet, was completely finished by November of 1942, just 14 months after ground was first broken on the project. As interior finishing work continued deeper into the building, landscape crews simultaneously planted the surrounding grounds with mature trees and formal gardens, several of which, remarkably, still stand today, over 80 years old, living witnesses to the exact moment this building was born. Engineers designed an ingenious corridor signage system that allowed any of the eventual 35,000 occupants to locate any point inside the massive structure within roughly 30 seconds, using a unique 5-character code assigned to every single location inside the building. 6 fully operational cafeterias, together capable of serving 35,000 meals per day, represented more total food service capacity than many entire American cities possessed in 1942. The project's final punch list, compiled in December of 1942, contained 5,700 individual items, every single one documented and fully resolved within the project's final 6 weeks alone. Just 4 months after breaking ground, the Pentagon was already 40% complete, a pace no construction project in American history had ever come close to matching before. The very first occupants moved into the building on April 29, 1942, while active construction was still very much underway on the floors directly above them. Officers sat working at their desks while wet concrete was poured just above their heads, separated from the falling debris and dust by nothing more than a single thin layer of temporary plywood sheeting. The building's central war room was constructed simultaneously alongside the rest of the structure, its internal design quietly modified almost weekly as evolving wartime requirements demanded constant last-minute changes. By the middle of 1942, real military operations were already actively being planned inside the building's war room, even while construction workers were still laying floor tiles barely 30 meters away down the hall. A dedicated basement road network allowed military vehicles and sensitive supplies to move throughout the building without ever having to appear at ground level or risk outside exposure. The on-site 15-kilovolt electrical substation ranked among the largest private power installations anywhere in the entire state of Virginia at that time, capable of supplying enough electricity for a city of roughly 50,000 people. Finally, on January 15, 1943, just 16 months after ground was first broken, the Pentagon stood fully complete and fully occupied, delivered exactly on schedule and remarkably under its original budget. The massive construction workforce dispersed. Almost immediately in January of 1943, some moving on to other wartime projects, others heading directly into active military service, an extraordinary undertaking quietly, almost invisibly, brought to completion. The original blueprints, an astonishing 2.5 million square feet of technical drawings produced in just 4 frantic days, are preserved today inside the National Archives, and the match between those original drawings and the actual finished building remains genuinely remarkable, a testament to the discipline of a team that had absolutely no room and no time for meaningful deviation. General Somerville's final inspection reportedly lasted only 4 hours. He personally signed the completion certificate and left without any public statement or ceremony whatsoever. Within days, 35,000 personnel were already coordinating the most complex military operation in American history from directly inside this brand new building. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy, was fully planned within these very walls. A building that had been nothing but a garbage-strewn swamp in 1941 went on to directly shape the ultimate outcome of the Second World War. The Pentagon itself survived the war completely intact. The same, tragically, could not be said for the millions of people whose fates were ultimately decided by the decisions made inside it. In the decades that followed, the Pentagon transformed into the true nerve center of the entire Cold War, a conflict fought not primarily with soldiers and tanks, but with intelligence networks, emerging technology, and the constant, looming threat of total annihilation hanging over every decision made inside those 5 walls. Remarkably, some of the very men who physically built the Pentagon were drafted into active military service within mere weeks of finishing construction, meaning they built America's command headquarters and then were sent off to fight in the exact war it was now commanding. What ultimately emerged from that forgotten swamp wasn't simply another government office complex. It was, in every meaningful sense, a declaration to the world, proof that America now possessed the will, the resources, and finally, the physical headquarters to back up its global ambitions. Look closely at this exterior wall. Limestone, set entirely by hand in freezing winter conditions, under a wartime deadline that allowed absolutely no room for error. And yet, every single joint remains tight even today. Every face of stone still looks remarkably clean. 80+ years later, and the stone still looks essentially like this. That's not simply good construction practice. That's genuine craftsmanship that has quietly outlasted every single person who originally created it. Every window opening throughout the building was hand-cut by skilled masons who fully understood their trade, with absolutely no shortcuts permitted anywhere on the building's public-facing exterior, because this was, quite literally, the face America intended to show the entire watching world. The overnight shifts never stopped, through relentless rain, through brutal cold, through the grim knowledge that the very war they were racing to build for was already actively killing people on the other side of the planet. A surviving photograph from October of 1942 shows a group of workers, and to this day, not one single man in that photograph has ever been formally identified by name. Their names were simply never recorded by the government that hired them in the first place. Just a stake driven into swampy ground, and a deadline that absolutely could not be argued with under any circumstances. Completing 6.5 million square feet of finished construction in 16 months isn't merely fast. By any reasonable engineering standard, it borders on the physically impossible. And yet, somehow, against every conceivable obstacle, it actually happened. When members of Congress personally inspected the fully completed building in February of 1943, several of them were reportedly rendered completely speechless by what they saw. This exact terrazzo flooring was laid down in 1942, and in the decades since, 80 years' worth of generals sitting, presidents and secretaries of state have walked directly across it. By 1943, the Pentagon's internal telephone exchange was handling more daily calls than any other single civilian building anywhere in the entire country. Inside the map rooms, abstract wartime strategy became terrifying reality. Colored pins representing real battalions, real ships, and real human lives hanging in the balance with every decision made. That hidden basement road network allowed military vehicles and classified materials to move freely throughout the building without ever once having to surface at street level. Small construction milestones were quietly celebrated as they happened, a brief pause among exhausted crews, and then work simply resumed immediately afterward because at this project, work always resumed. The very first American flag flew above the fully completed Pentagon in January of 1943, and the building would go on to guide a global war effort for another 2.5 grueling years beyond that milestone. 17.5 miles of corridors, 5 distinct floors, 5 concentric rings, 10 connecting spokes, 284 restrooms, 691 water fountains, and functional office space for 35,000 full-time occupants. From the very moment it was declared complete, the Pentagon operated at absolute full capacity immediately. the demands of an active global war allowing for no gradual settling in period whatsoever. When Allied forces launched the D-Day invasion, 156,000 troops, 6,939 vessels, and 11,590 aircraft, every single piece of that staggering operation was coordinated from a building that had been nothing but an abandoned swamp just 3 years earlier. On VE Day, May 8, 1945, the very same building that had directly helped win the war in Europe stood essentially unchanged, already quietly pivoting its full attention toward the ongoing war in the Pacific. When the Second World War finally ended, the Pentagon itself most certainly did not, because it had never actually been built for just one single war in the first place. It had been built for whatever inevitably came next. Korea, Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the entire sprawling arc of the Cold War. More than 80 consecutive years of global conflict processed, planned, and directed from within these same five-sided walls. Between 1993 and 2011, the Pentagon underwent an enormous internal renovation program, stripped essentially down to its bare original structural frame, with every single internal system rebuilt completely from scratch. That renovation effort, known internally as PenRen, installed over 100 miles of brand new fiber optic cabling, an entirely modern HVAC system, and extensive security measures that the building's original 1940s architects could never have realistically imagined. Then came September 11th, 2001. A hijacked aircraft struck the Pentagon directly, the very same building whose original construction had, by pure historical coincidence, begun exactly 60 years earlier to the day, on September 11th, 1941. 184 people lost their lives that day, and yet the building's original structural frame held, the concentric rings held, the building, quite literally, stood. The damaged section was fully rebuilt within just 11 months, restored using precisely matching Indiana limestone, sourced specifically to honor the exact craftsmanship of the building's original 1940s construction crews. Today, that replacement stone matches the surrounding original limestone so precisely that visitors genuinely cannot locate the seam between old and new without being told exactly where to look. The Pentagon Memorial officially opened in 2008, featuring 184 individual illuminated benches, one for each victim, arranged on the exact patch of ground where the aircraft struck the building nearly 2 decades earlier. At night, those 184 memorial benches quietly glow across the grounds of a building whose very construction began on the identical calendar date that would, 6 decades later, take the lives of the very people they now permanently commemorate. 6.5 million square feet of usable interior space, more total office space than the Empire State Building itself, all delivered in just 16 months of relentless wartime construction. Viewed from directly overhead today, the Pentagon looks essentially identical to how it appeared back in 1943, because permanence, quite deliberately, was always the entire underlying intention behind its original design. Pentagon employees have, for generations now, quietly nicknamed the building's central open-air courtyard Ground Zero, a grim, knowing joke that speaks volumes about this specific building's uniquely heavy place within modern American history. From an abandoned, garbage-strewn swamp to 4 frantic days of hand-drawn architectural sketches, to 16 relentless months of non-stop human labor, emerged one of the single most recognizable, most consequential buildings anywhere on the face of the earth. And yet, to this day, not one single man appearing in that surviving construction photograph has ever been formally identified by name. They built the most powerful military headquarters in recorded human history, and in the most literal sense possible, the very institution they built went on to forget them completely. Try for a moment to actually sit with the scale of what happened here, because it's the kind of number that slides past you unless you force yourself to stop and picture it properly. 6.5 million square feet, built not over a decade, not over 5 years, but in the same span of time it takes most modern cities just to finish approving the paperwork for a single mid-sized office tower. And it wasn't built with cranes lifting prefabricated steel modules into place or computer-optimized concrete pours calculated down to the minute. It was built by 13,000 Virginians pulled together in days, by ironworkers balanced on exposed steel beams with no harnesses, by masons setting Indiana limestone by hand in freezing temperatures, by surveyors walking the site every single week with nothing but instruments and trained eyesight to make sure 5 separately built sections of an enormous building would still line up perfectly where they met. There is something almost humbling about realizing that the exact ground you might be standing on today, if you ever visit, was once nothing but discarded trash and standing water, and that within 16 months, human beings turned that same ground into the operational heart of the most powerful military force the world has ever known. Consider, too, what it must have felt like to be one of those 15,000 anonymous workers showing up before sunrise in the freezing Virginia winter, watching a genuine wasteland slowly rise, floor by floor, ring by ring, into something that would eventually coordinate the invasion of Normandy from rooms you helped physically construct with your own hands, and then never having your name written down anywhere connected to any of it. That's the quiet tragedy sitting underneath every triumphant statistic in the story. The concrete pilings, the record-breaking pours, the limestone shipped in from Indiana, all of it is genuinely remarkable, but none of it explains itself. Behind every single number is a person who worked through a brutal winter, who ate lunch standing up because the shift never technically paused, who went home exhausted to a rented room somewhere nearby, and who then, in many cases, was drafted into the very war this building had just been built to command. And maybe that's the real reason this building still feels different from every other construction project on Earth. It isn't just an engineering achievement, it's a monument built by people history quietly chose not to remember, standing exactly where it always stood, still holding every secret, every decision, every consequence that has passed through its 5 concentric rings for more than 80 years running. I've personally spent months inside this building working on this documentary, walking these exact corridors, standing in these exact rooms, and I can tell you, honestly, I still can't fully grasp the true scale of what was actually accomplished here in just 16 months. Subscribe for more.